Well, thank you, speakers, for all ending right on time without needing much discipline, to be disciplined by me. So I do a round of one question to each one of you, and then since in earlier sessions we experienced that there are many questions, I open it up after one question. So I start in the same sequence as we gave the presentations. So Peter, we know that the effects from like DMT or other drugs, so that they have a therapeutic effect is because they make it easier to rewire the brain. So they give us more neural plasticity, so that if a person has, for example, an addiction problem, after a DMT session, they can easily rewire their brain, and often they do, so that they get rid of the addiction problem. So what would metaphysics do? Would metaphysics also rewire our brains then? Or would we just like have the Whiteheadian plane is like a conceptual trip up, so, and then we need to land after the conceptual trip and have a deeper experience? Or is it more like, and that's what I think actually, it's more like Frankl's logotherapy, that at some point we have to make sense of it all, because humans are meaning creatures. We want meaning, and metaphysics gives us meaning. So what in addition to the drug experience does metaphysics really give us? Okay.
Well, it's interesting because there are developments now to create psychedelic drugs which have no phenomenology at all, so that they only work on the brain. But there are many skeptics for that procedure. Number one, because psychedelic means mind manifesting, so it's not really a psychedelic if it doesn't manifest the mind. Secondly, though, I think it's related to your work on mental causation to some extent, that the real therapeutic mechanism of psychedelics is that it creates, as it were, a small self. It gives people a perspective on their life where their life and their problems become relatively unimportant, and their table of values changes, is altered. So therefore, as a result of which, they don't need to, for example, mask their problems with alcohol, because their problems seem relatively irrelevant. The mechanism of that, of course, is the experience itself. It's what I call, a metaphysical experience. So that is, I would say, a crucial aspect of that psychedelic therapeutic process. Of course, it would be correlated to the brain in some manner, but I don't think, as a Whiteheadian, that, you get the full causal sufficiency by looking at matter only, or abstraction that is matter. You have to realize that matter is an abstraction which includes mind, and therefore the phenomenological sort of downward causation of such an experience is as causally efficacious as anything in the brain. As a quick answer.
Thank you very much. Sheri, thank you for your very inspiring talk, Overcoming Alienation Through Integration and Finding the Eschaton as an Inner Event. It's also an historical event, it's also an event in the future of some objectivity, but I would be interested how you relate those two aspects of the eschaton. So if a believer says, I believe in the resurrection, and we would tell her that this is just an inner psychological event, she might think I misunderstood. So do you believe that like the individual resurrection is really also an inner psychological event, so that it's an inner transformation into a different reality? So what is exactly, in your view, the relationship between what psychology describes, Jungian psychology, and this otherworldly, transcendent eschaton? How do you see the relationship between the objective and the inner eschaton?
Well, I think that, when Christ calls us to carry our own cross, he's not suggesting that every person needs to go be crucified and experiment with possibly being resurrected again in the way that Christians believe Jesus was. So clearly he's talking about an inner shift, some kind of a dying to self and that possibility of being reborn into a new way of living. And so I think that the inner eschaton to me is that preceding change that then changes the way we live in the world. And whether or not there is what the future eschaton might look like, I have no idea. And whether the new heaven and new earth means that that's some kind of objective change to the way the entire world appears to us or is experienced by us, I don't know. But I do know that we can experience an inner change that is so significant that it changes everything about the way we live in the world. So I would see that the inner eschaton allows for that kind of change, and as developmental creatures, we're still in a process of development. But I think the more individuals can experience that kind of radical shift, I believe it will change the way we live in the world, the way we treat the earth and each other, the way we treat the non-human beings in the world. And then whatever happens beyond that, if there is an eschaton that is a different new heaven and new earth, I wouldn't want to really speculate on that.
Thank you very much. So my final questions before I hand over to the audience. Merlin, very fascinating talk about Whitehead and fungi. Whitehead wanted to replace substance metaphysics by a metaphysics of experience and subjectivity. So I was wondering, where is the subjectivity in your model? And it seemed to me it's in the tip of the fungus, so to speak. That's where the creativity is, the openness to the future. So the rest of it, like what's that in Whiteheadian metaphysics? And that seems to be the relation part. And you said at one point, is it tips or networks? And you said it's both. And that seems to me to mirroring the idea that in Whiteheadian ontology, it's not you have the relation first and then the relata, or you have the relata first and then the relation, because they come at the same moment, so to speak. They're both equally ontologically fundamental, because there is no relatum without relationships and no relationship without relata. So it's more a question, have I understood it correctly? So that's it's mirroring somehow Whiteheadian ontology, because we have like the actual entity in the tip, that's where the experience is, the creativity, but they are connected to all the other tips, so to speak, by this vast network of prehensions, and that's facilitated in your picture, so to speak. That's how they are called, the connections. I don't know the English word even for these threads or
the hyphae.
Yeah, by them. So I'm still a bit struggling about the Whiteheadian metaphysics. That's what I understood. Maybe you can elaborate on it.
Yeah, no, I think you put your finger completely on, precisely on the point of uncertainty and imperfection with this comparison, which, so of course we're dealing here with a space for time substitution, which is one of the reasons why it's easy to grasp, because you can see it there. But in a Whiteheadian schema, the process that is the present moment of concrescence is happening now on top of collections, aggregations of past decisions that layer on complex roots through time. And so exactly as you said, so the growing tips, so the actual occasions, the pulse of their growing is the concrescence. The past decisions are the tube, the pipe that they left behind them, which relate to all other past decisions through the network that they form together. And so all the concressing moments that occur in any one of these tips is informed by what's happened in the past, because they are all part of that big network of past decisions, which remains in front of our eyes here in this pedagogical way. So the question is, given that this is a network here and now in the present, and these are tubes through which matter is passing, this isn't just the past, this isn't just objective immortality, these are active parts of the fungus. Stuff is passing through these tubes. And so this does raise the question. It suggests a kind of activity for the past, and I know this is a subject of debate among Whiteheadians, how active is the past. So this is a point where the analogy perhaps breaks down. I hope that makes it clearer.
Thank you very much. Then we open it up to, and please tell us to whom the question is addressed.
2 quick comments. Playfully, Merlin, and to your comment, Godehard, it looked like the heads of the actual occasions, it's like actual occasions with tails. And then Sheri asked what the inner eschaton looks like. Well, maybe it looks something like that.
Hi, thank you to all of you. That was really fascinating. My question's for Peter, but I want to frame it by just speaking to Merlin's point, the emphasis you made on interdisciplinary scholarship. It's a wholehearted belief of mine that transdisciplinary praxis is absolutely fundamental if we are to properly shift consciousness and change the paradigm incontrovertibly. I'm specifically interested in my PhD research in the intersection of cosmology, higher dimensional mathematics, quantum mechanics, and aesthetics. With that in mind, considering psychedelic experiences and from a conversation I had with the mathematician Ralph Abraham, I understand psychedelics to basically be blasting a hole through the dimensions. Do you think metaphysics is enough in terms of helping people integrate their experience and actualizing the potential of psychedelics and shifting consciousness? Is metaphysics enough, seeing as that could be relegated by mainstream scientists as purely philosophical speculation? Don't we need some sort of cosmological grounding that substantiates metaphysical speculation?
What comes first, physics or metaphysics? This is I won't answer that. I'd say, first of all, let's say it's not enough. It's not sufficient metaphysics integration for psychedelic experience. I always suggest that it's an additional and optional tool that the therapist can make use of. And I've spoken to many therapists on the ground who are, would appreciate such a tool because, like I say, it is a metaphysical experience, right? So number one, I don't think it is sufficient, but I think it's very important. Secondly, do we need to ground metaphysics in a sort of in a cosmology that is respected by physicists? I mean, I think we do. I think physics is insufficient, generally speaking. For a start, I mean, we know that. The basic problem of physics is, relativity theory doesn't cohere with quantum theory, number one, so we know it's incomplete. But secondly, it doesn't say much, if anything, about the mind. And so obviously we can foresee that the future developments will be a fusion between physics and psychology. But of course, to a certain extent, that's what Whitehead provides. So I think that, and there are people in this audience, of course, who work on trying to ground physics in a Whiteheadian metaphysics, so that's the way I personally see the future, but there's obviously other futures. With regard to third thing, with regard to dimensions of space and psychedelic experience, in my book over there, right? The last chapter's on n-dimensional space in relation to psychedelic experience, and that interestingly relates to some of what Whitehead said in an essay called Uniformity and Contingency. He speaks about dreams and dimensions of space in relation to relativity. But it's very interesting if you apply that to psychedelic experience, which you can see as kind of excessive dreams in many ways.
Hi, Jared Morningstar. Question for Sheri. So I really liked the trans-religious approach of your idea of inner eschatology and transformation. But I do have a interest in this aspect of sort of transcending law and how that fits in along with this trans-religious approach. So myself, coming from an Islamic spiritual perspective, legal spirituality, religious law is not merely sort of instrumental, but really at the heart of what transformation and realization of God identity involves. And I can imagine that could be true for certain Jewish or Confucian friends as well. So I'm wondering, how can you sort of incorporate that aspect in your model, or is it sort of inherently going to be a little more antagonistic towards those sorts of legal spiritual perspectives?
Yeah, thanks, Jared. For that, I would draw again back to Doug King's integral theology and say that in the shift from tier 1 to tier 2 and form to formless, you still can use form. Form can still play a role. So I would say law, scripture, other aspects of what we would call form are still play an important role, but in and of themselves, they are not the source of God identity. And the reason for that is because then, when a particular system becomes the source of God identity, it excludes everyone else. And so when we can hold lightly to our systems and see the beauty in them and what they can do for us and the way they can be vehicles and methods for that transformation, then they're a beautiful thing. It's when they become the source of identity that then excludes everyone else that they're a problem. And that causes separation and death.
Oh, hello. Thanks a lot for your presentation. A question for Dr. Kling and Sheldrake. Dr. Kling, so there's a phenomena with social media, with young girls, teenage girls. Somebody on the other side of the world can make a post on your social media, and then that person commits suicide. They're so fragile inside that, a non-entity can drive them in that direction. They have no zest for life. They're hopeless in some way. I grew up in an age where we would just throw that stuff off. I mean, bullying is real, but why would I let a gnat drive me to suicide? And so, my assessment is they've lost an inner strength. There's an inner grit that's lost, and I don't know how a society retrieves that when it's just so pervasive. And I guess British Health Service has good statistics on some. So 40% of teenage girls in Britain have thought about suicide. 30% of them, I think, are on antidepressants and anti-anxiety. So comment on that. And Dr. Sheldrake, could you just comment a little more about metaphor? I'm reading a book by Gabriel Marcel right now, and he talks about, it's a real difference when you talk about participating with people and say relation. When you're participating, you're really acting, and when you feel something, it's different than a sensation. So sensation and relations are kind of ways to stand away and not actually engage. I understand the difference between how we act and our words, but the way we use those words are important. Like Levinas would say, you don't need to have a relation with a person. You owe something to their face. They're right there and you owe them. And so Whitehead would want us to indwell and act and feel things and respond to a face, but we talk about them in kind of objectified terms that distance us. So I wonder if you could talk about how we use the metaphor.
Should I go first? I'll just mention quickly basically the argument in my book is that we're so fragmented at all levels of society. And that Whitehead and Jung provide resources that are integrating. And when you put them together, we see in both of their work, I pulled out 3 core themes. At the level of the cosmos and of the psyche, we see value, relationality, and transformation. And then when you combine that with a practice, like dream work is the one that I chose, but there are many others. And I would say to the earlier question that a practice might be another good way to maintain an integration after a psychedelic experience. But when we combine that understanding of cosmos and psyche that has these 3 elements with a practice that then reveals the truth of those elements, then we know for ourselves that we matter, we belong, and we can experience positive change. And to me, that is a message of hope, that if we can bring people to understand themselves and our whole world in that way, that it carries that meaning. It's not a meaningless world. We are not random, isolated entities unconnected to everything else. And we aren't just the victims of lifetimes of suffering or trauma. We can actually experience positive change. That, to me, is a hopeful message.
Thanks for your question. I would agree with Whitehead that it's very much about our actions, that our actions are vitally important and ultimately what connects us with the web of becoming that we're all a part of. When I talk about metaphor, I'm not saying it's metaphor or action. Rather, that metaphor is just not an option. It's just a way that we something we always have to use. If you look at our language, you can think of it as a sort of history of past metaphors. These metaphors have become idioms over time, to the point we forget they maybe once were a metaphor, created in a poetic moment, becomes so normalized that we then forget about it. But these metaphors, I think, are important, right? Because think about the metaphor of the machine. This has governed so much human activity for a very long time. And in the the arising of the mechanical philosophy, the concept of a machine was a heuristic tool. It was, what if we treat the world as if it was a machine, and we'll bracket off formal and final causes over here. No less important, but we can't do such empirical stuff with them. So what if it was like a machine, and then we can do this kind of investigation? But that metaphor metastasized into a metaphysics over the course of a few decades, and has left us in all sorts of problems ever since. So Joseph Needham talks very well about this as well. He talks about metaphors as providing a net of coordinates that can guide our thinking. I think about the armatures, the wire armatures that a sculptor might use to support wet clay. And so this is what I mean with the metaphors as a generative practice, to reimagine our metaphors, to find new coordinates, new nets of coordinates, new wireframes, and to try and displace unhealthy metaphors that might no longer serve us.
Great, thank you. Stephen Smith, both to Peter and Merlin potentially here, when you were talking about coming into after the psychedelic experience and starting to work with the integrating the metaphysics in, particularly with a focus on nature relatedness and developing a deeper sort of conductivity between the human and the natural world. Can you develop that a little bit more? And because after the psychedelic experience, there's clearly an afterglow, and then there's a period where it tends to taper off when you look at some of the studies looking at nature relatedness. How would you sustain that? And then, Merlin, I mean, picking up on the biological relatedness, is there a way to, in this metaphysics of the interrelatedness, to bring in the role of fungi as an example of that? Just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, there's a number of empirical studies, as you might know, then, on nature connectedness. So, number one, there's a correlation between nature connectedness, which we could define in many ways, and mental health. So there's that, and that sort of then infuses a lot of investment in companies. And then there's secondary empirical research, led especially by a guy called Sam Gandhi, on how psychedelics can induce nature connectedness and thus help mental health. And I've spoken to Sam Gandhi about this, and that's a description. That's that's what seems to happen. But from a more metaphysical point of view, the interesting question is why? Why does it induce that, or what does it mean? Is that nature connectedness a mere delusion, like a hallucination, as it were, that psychedelics can induce? Or is there some kind of truth to it? Is there some veridicality to that nature connectedness? So, and this is where I think Whitehead especially becomes important with regard to his concept of prehensions, which I consider really the key, his greatest gift to humanity. So why? Because the concept, I'm preaching to the converted here, but, as you know, very basically, the theory of prehension is one of direct connection to nature, to the outside world. Well, immediately one's past, but of course, that's one is an abstraction, one is part of the environment. So it's an immediate connection to that which one sees. It's direct. That's why he's a realist as opposed to an idealist. That's why it's called process and reality. We relate, after Bradley's appearance in reality, right? He was an idealist. So what Whitehead can provide more than any other philosopher, I believe, Bergson to a certain extent with his concept of sympathy, if you know that, which I think influenced Whitehead a bit. But what Whitehead's metaphysics can provide is a good, solid foundation to explain that nature connectedness that it seems that psychedelics can amplify. And how can that generally lead to therapy? Well, I think that, again, what it means is in that afterglow period you speak about, where people are more open to metaphysical change, it can provide people with good reasons to accept that apprehension of nature connectedness, again, as veridical and not something to be dismissed later on. also provides a criticism of one's general metaphysic. There is no such thing as a neutral metaphysic. You can't avoid it, right? You're sort of born into it. So I think that's how Whitehead can be used practically in these trials. That's only in the clinic. Of course, for so-called healthy people, it can enrich their life. And there's, I think, the future at the present. The medicinal route is important. It gives a kind of credibility to psychedelic research, but looking to the future, if we take it carefully, unlike what happened in the 60s, there could be some societal enrichment there as well, and that's where Whitehead could play a pivotal role.
Dr. Schill?
Just quickly to say that I think of fungi as kind of ecological poster organisms. All life is lived with other organisms. Ecology is the study of the thicket of relationships that house all organisms in their place and in their time. So I think fungi can help us to think about relation. They can help us to figure ecological relations, but they aren't the only organisms that do that. So I think perhaps the reasons why some of these spending time outside in so-called nature connection can be helpful is because we are returning to a state of being with, and being with that which is not just human. And so in returning to that kind of condition, we are able to find our healthy, remember what it means to be healthy. What it means to be healthy is to be with. It's the togetherness that puts the con in concrescence, I've always assumed. Maybe I'm wrong there.
Well, thank you very much. I think this session was... Okay, I read this as stop it.
So, Dr. Sheldrake, you might have just answered the question I was going to ask you, which is a strange question because it's actually your question. Oops, sorry. I was just saying I was going to ask you a strange question in that it is your own question that I'd like to have you respond to in your amazing book, where you talk about how fungi are veteran survivors of ecological disruption. Their ability to cling on and often flourish through periods of catastrophic change is one of their defining characteristics. They are inventive, flexible, and collaborative. With much of life on Earth threatened by human activity, are there ways we can partner with fungi to help us adapt? And let me jump to the end of the next paragraph where you develop that question. Many symbioses, you say, have formed in times of crisis. The algal partner in a lichen can't make a living on a bare rock without striking up a relationship with a fungus. Might it be that we can't adjust to life on a damaged planet without cultivating new fungal relationships? So it just seems to me rather eco-prophetically important questions there. I'd love to hear how you'd answer them.
Well, my short answer would be, I do think that forming new relationships, not just with fungi, but with other animals and other plants, other consortia of animals, plants, bacteria as well, are some of the places we should exactly be thinking about at this time. And there's a lot of precedent for this. Humans have done this for a very long time, of course. If we think about the way we outsource our metabolisms to fungi in the process of fermentation, think about alcohol, think about the making of bread by yeasts, which are fungi, think about the production of miso, soy sauce. These are all fungal processes that we envelop within human culture and which in turn shape the cultures that envelop them in complex feedback loops. Think about the first few times when people started traveling with a horse, how this transformed what's possible transport-wise. There's a wonderful term, a thinker called Natasha Myers uses this term, involution, a rolling or a curling inwards. She contrasts this with evolution, which is this rolling outwards, and she thinks that involution better captures the inventive ways that organisms find ways to live alongside one another creatively, and that this is really what characterizes the history of life. So I think it would also be something we could say characterizes the history of humans. And I think it's somewhere where we could look right now. moving forward. There are specific instances I could give with fungi, if you would be interested. For example, making new materials out of fungi, leather-like materials. You can grow fungi on agricultural waste products. You can grow these materials in a couple of weeks. You don't need cows, you don't need the fields to feed the cows, and so forth. There are ways that we can, fungal medicines, lots of ways that the metabolic ingenuity of fungi could produce medicines that help us restore health to ourselves and other organisms we depend on. There are ways that we might be able to be more mycologically inclusive when we practice forestry or agriculture, for example. There are lots of ways. And I think it speaks to an evolutionary refrain, and this involution is something I come back to all the time.
Yeah, this is from Merlin. I have not read your book, so I'm sorry if for some reason I'm missing a broader context. But my question is, well, it begins with a comment. You began your talk by saying that through the study of mycology, right, we can see that there are no individuals. Later, when you were describing the growth of mycelium, you said, well, are they singular or are they multitudes? And well, they're both, right? And so I had a kind of a question, because on the one hand, there's this temptation to say, well, by the state of the current science, right, it gives us a great model to understand metaphysics in a more general sense and to generalize from that. But in another sense, that's precisely what Whitehead was saying metaphysics shouldn't do, in so far as if you just base your metaphysics off of Newtonian physics, right, you're going to get it wrong. But the job of metaphysics is rather to correct the overstatements of the special sciences. So I wanted to see if, as tempting as it is to say, well, look, we can see exactly what Whitehead was trying to communicate in more concrete terms here if we talk mycologically. If we can invert that and say, well, in what way does Whitehead challenge mycology, right, to say that, well, things could be otherwise, right? Because the job of metaphysics is to correct that overstatement. So I was just wondering if you could say anything about, right, inverting the relationship between biology and metaphysics in that sense.
Thank you. Yes, first with the individual's point you raised, yeah, exactly what you describe as the kind of tortured confusion that I experience and many others that I know experience when we wrestle with these categories. You know, when we spend a lot of time looking at the world as biologists, it becomes clear that individuality is it's not a natural fact, but rather a category that depends on our point of view. We do need to use this concept now and then. It would be difficult to get a passport or to fill in your tax returns if we couldn't depend on this, at least transiently. So yes, I own up to any incoherent confusions that I might have communicated. It will continue to happen. Regarding the point about the metaphysics, yes, so it's, for me, I think where I'm coming from, I was taking on board this piece of Whitehead's thought that experience should be something that we take very seriously, and that should be where we begin. And so why I showed those videos is because looking at my experience that I have within myself in a dark room is an aspect of my experience, but me watching the organisms around me do their thing is also something that I'm experiencing. And so I was talking more with these videos about watching the fungi do their thing. Obviously I'm filtering it through the lens of modern mycology as a discipline. But for me, it was more about returning to the experience of watching and being with these organisms and letting that experience form some kind of route for a metaphysical inquiry. But I have a lot to learn. I'd love to talk more about that maybe afterwards.
Thank you. Since when we started, there were just way fewer people here. Just a reminder, if you Google Munich Whitehead in 2023, you find the website for the conference and you're all invited to come and submit papers and so on. What is left to me is to thank Peter, Sheri, and Merlin for a wonderful session.